All right, guys, welcome back. Today we are on letter 58 on Seneca's Moral Letters to Lucilius, and this is on being. So let's jump right into it here. He says, "How scant of words are languages, nay, how poverty stricken. I have not fully understood until today. We happen to be speaking of Plato, and 1,000 subjects came up for discussion, which needed names and yet possessed none. And there were certain others which once possessed, but have since lost their words because we were too nice about their use. But who can endure to be nice in the midst of poverty?" Okay. So, what is he talking about here? He's talking about how he's expressing his concern that a language does not express enough of the concepts that he wants to talk about. So there's actually not enough vocabulary to express everything that he would like to say. Right? In verse 2, he says, "There is an insect called by the Greeks Osterus," which, let's see what that is. The gadfly. Okay. So the gadfly. All right. Which drives cattle wild and scatters them all over their pasturing grounds. It used to be called Acilius in our language, as you may believe on the authority of Virgil. He quotes Virgil here. "Near Salarius groves and eke Abernus shades. Of green-clad oak trees filts an insect named Acilius by the Romans. In the Greek, the word is rendered osterius. With a rough and strident sound, it buzzes and drives wild the terror-stricken herds throughout the woods." Okay, so he's talking about the gadfly, and we don't exactly know why, where he's going with this, but let us see. In verse 3, he says, "By which I infer that the word has gone out of use, and, not to keep you waiting too long, there were certain uncompounded words current, like Sunere, ferro, inter se, as will be proved again by Virgil. Great heroes born in various lands had come to settle matters mutually with the sword. This settling matters we now express as discerne. The plain word has become obsolete." Okay, so again, going into the vocabulary here of the Greek, the specifics of the Greek language, not exactly easy, but let's see what else he has to say. "The ancients used to say issu instead of isiro in conditional clauses. You need not take my word, but you may again turn to Virgil. The other soldiers shall conduct the fight with me where I shall bid." Okay, so we're just going to verse 5. "It is not in my purpose to show, by this array of examples, how much time I have wasted on the study of language. I merely wish you to understand how many words that were current in the works of Ennius and Accius have become moldy with age, while even in the case of Virgil, whose works are explored daily, some of his words have been filched away from us." Okay, so he's making some points here about, obviously you can tell that Seneca is well studied in linguistics as well, right? But he's making some points about words becoming out of use. So let's see what he has to say about this. Why is this important? He says, "You will say, I suppose, what is the purpose and meaning of this preamble? I shall not keep you in the dark. I desire, if possible, to say the word essentia to you and to obtain a favorable hearing. If I cannot do this, I shall risk it even though it put you out of humor. I have Cicero as an authority for the use of this word, and I regard him as a powerful authority. If you desire testimony of a later date, I shall cite Fabanius, careful of speech, cultivated, and so polished in style that he will suit even our nice tastes. For what can we do, my dear Lucilius? How otherwise can we find a word for that which the Greeks call..." I can't even pronounce that because I can't read the Greek. "Something that is indispensable, something that is the natural substratum of everything. I beg you accordingly to allow me to use this word essentia. I shall nevertheless take pains to exercise the privilege which you have granted me with as sparing a hand as possible. Perhaps I shall be content with the mere right." Okay, so this is a little bit confusing about this word essentia. There's not really a footnote on this. There's some footnotes here for some of the pieces of this, and there's a lot of footnotes here because this is quite a complicated piece here. He says, Cicero usually says natura. The word, according to Quintilian, was first used by a certain Sergius Flavius, also found in okay, and then so I don't think this really gives us very much extra context here. I did see a note. I must not use other imported words to explain essentia, what is not a native Latin word, but invented as a literal transliteration of oh. I'm assuming that sounds like essentia. So, okay. Let's move on because there's quite a bit on this one. All right. So, we'll see here. All right. And I may run out of time. Okay. Yet what good will your indulgence do me, if lo and behold I can in no wise express in Latin the meaning of the word, which gave me the opportunity to rail at the poverty of our language, and you will condemn our narrow Roman limits even more when you find out there is a word of one syllable which I cannot transliterate. What is it, you ask? It is the word whatever that is. You think me lacking in facility? You believe that the word is ready to hand? It might be translated by quod est. I notice, however, a great difference. You are forcing me to render a noun by a verb. Okay, so we're getting really into the language technicalities here, but we're going to press on. But if I must do so, I shall render it by quod est. There are 6 ways in which Plato expresses this idea. According to a friend of ours, a man of great learning, who mentioned the fact today, and I shall explain all of them to you. If I may first point out that there is something called genus and something called species. For the present, however, we are seeking the primary idea of genus, on which the others, the different species, depend, which is the source of all classification, the term under which universal ideas are embraced. And the idea of genus will be reached if we begin to reckon back from particulars, for in this way we shall be conducted back to the primary notion. Again, I don't have a lot to say on this. We'll just go on here. Now, man is a species. As Aristotle says, so is horse or dog. We must therefore discover some common bond for all these terms, one which embraces them and holds them subordinate to itself. And what is this? It is animal. And so there begins to be a genus animal, including all the terms man, horse, and dog. Okay, so he's going over, we're getting into kind of the science side of philosophy here. The ancient philosophers did not just concern themselves with life philosophy, okay, and how to live. A lot of it was all kind of mixed in. Like from philosophy, really science originated, right? Discovering the nature of things. And so we're getting into some of that here. But there are certain things which have life, anima, and are not yet animals. For it is agreed that plants and trees possess life, and that is why we speak of them as living and dying. Therefore, the term living things will occupy a still higher place because both animals and plants are included in this category. Certain objects, however, lack life, such as rocks. There will therefore be another term to take precedence over living things, and that is substance. I shall classify substance by saying that all substances are either animate or inanimate. Again, we're getting into the classification of things here, and you can kind of see how these classifications make sense to the mind in the primitive world, right? So, and why these things might have come about this way. In 11, but there is still something superior to substance, for we speak of certain things as possessing substance and certain things as lacking substance. What, then, will be the term for which these things are derived? It is that to which we lately gave an inappropriate name, that which exists. For by using this term, they will be divided into species so that we can say that which exists either possesses or lacks substance. We'll just move on here. Verse 12. This, therefore, is what genus is, the primary, original, and, to play upon the word, general. Of course, there are the other genera, but they are special genera, man being, for example, a genus, for man comprises species by nations, Greek, Roman, Parthian, by colors, white, black, yellow. The term compromises individuals also, Cato, Cicero, Lucidorus. So man falls into the category genus in so far as it includes many kinds, but in so far as it is subordinate to another term, it falls into the category species. But the genus, that which exists, is general and has no term superior to it. It is the first term in the classification of things, and all things are included under it. So he's getting into the nitty-gritty of classification, and he's really talking about how you can consider, depends on what level you look at, whether you consider something a species or the broader term or the broader category. All right. The Stoics would set ahead of this and still another genius, even more primary, concerning which I shall immediately speak, after proving that genius, which has been discussed above, has rightly been placed first, being as it is capable of including everything. Okay. 14. I therefore distribute that which exists into two species, things with and things without substance. And there is no third class. And how do I distribute substance? By saying that is either animate or inanimate. And how I distribute animate? By saying certain things have mind while others have only life. Or the idea may be expressed as follows. Certain things have the power of movement, of progress, of change of position, while others are rooted in the ground. They are fed and they grow only through the roots. Again, into what species do I divide animals? They're either perishable or imperishable. So again, we're going into some of the technicalities of this, so bear with me on this. Okay. He says, certain of the Stoics regard the primary genius as the something. I shall add the reasons they give for this belief. They say in the order of nature, some things exist and other things do not exist, and even the things that do not exist are really part of the order of nature. What these are will readily occur to the mind. For example, centaurs, giants, and all other figments of unsound reasoning, which have begun to have a definite shape, although they have no bodily consistency. Okay, so now he's talking about things that don't exist. He's talking about that you could divide things into some things that exist in nature and some things that don't exist. For example, like centaurs. Right. Now, in verse 16, he says, "But now I return to the subject which I promised to discuss for you, namely, how it is that Plato divides all existing things in 6 different ways. The first class of that which exists cannot be grasped by the sight or by touch or by any of the senses, but it can be grasped by the thought. Any generic conception, such as the generic idea man, does not come within the range of the eyes, but man in particular does, as, for example, Cicero, Cato. The term animal is not seen. It is grasped by thought alone. A particular animal, however, is seen, for example, a horse or a dog. Okay, so he's saying that there's a conceptual idea of man or animal, all right? And there's specific ones. The conceptual idea does not exist. It's not tangible. The second class of things which exist, according to Plato, is that which is prominent and stands out above everything else. This, he says, exists in a preeminent degree. The word poet is used indiscriminately, for this term is applied to all writers of verse, but among the Greeks it has come to be the distinguishing mark of a single individual. You know that Homer is meant when you hear men say, the poet. What then is this preeminent being? God, surely one who is greater and more powerful than anyone else. So he's talking about this other class, which is a division to say the archetype of the thing, right? So when you say the poet, he's talking about a specific individual, Homer, but it is this kind of a classification that Plato made. All right. The third class is made up of those things which exist in the proper sense of the term. They are countless in number, but are situated beyond our sight. What are these, you ask? They are Plato's own furniture, so to speak. He calls them ideas, and from them all visible things are created, and according to their pattern, all things are fashioned. They are immoral, unchangeable, unviolable. Okay, we'll just move on here. In verse 19, he says, and this idea, or rather Plato's conception of it, is as follows. The idea is the everlasting pattern of those things which are created by nature. I shall explain this definition in order to set the subject before you in a clearer light. Suppose that I wish to make a likeness of you. I possess in your own possession the pattern of this picture, wherefrom my mind receives a certain outline, which is to embody its own handiwork. The outward appearance, then, which gives me instruction and guidance, this pattern for me to imitate, is the idea. Such patterns, therefore, nature possesses an infinite number of men, fish, trees, according to whose model everything that nature has to create is worked out. Okay, so we don't really have a time for a full treatise on Plato's forms, but this idea is a concept that he's explaining here, and he's saying that if you have the likeness, the idea of a thing, then you could create a physical representation of that thing, and that's what makes it an idea, is that it is very specific in this case, but it is not concrete. In verse 20, he says, in the fourth place, we shall put form. And if you would know what form means, you must pay close attention, calling Plato and not me to account for the difficulty of the subject. However, we cannot make fine distinctions without encountering difficulties. A moment ago, I made use of the artist as an illustration. When the artist desired to reproduce Virgil in colors, he would gaze upon Virgil himself. The idea was Virgil's outward appearance, and this was the pattern of the intended work. That which the artist draws from this idea and has embodied his own work is the form. So we'll just move on here. In verse 21, he says, "Do you ask me where the difference lies? The former is the pattern, while the latter is the shape taken from the pattern embodied in the work. Our artist follows the one, but the other he creates. A statue has a certain external appearance. This external appearance of the statue is the form. And the pattern itself has a certain external appearance. By gazing upon which the sculptor has fashioned his statue, this is the idea. If you desire a further distinction, I will say that the form is in the artist's work, the idea outside his work, and not only outside it, but prior to it." Okay, so what he's saying is that the form is the actual construction of the work, whereas the idea is the thing that exists outside of the work itself. It is the higher level concept. Okay. The fifth class is made up of things which exist in the usual sense of the term. These things are the first that have to do with us. Here we have all such things as men, cattle, and things. In the sixth class goes all that which is a fictitious existence, like a void or time. Whatever is concrete to the sight or touch. Plato does not include among the things which he believes to be existent in the strict sense of the term. These things are the first that have to do with us. Here we have all such things as men, cattle, and things, for they are in a state of flux, constantly diminishing or increasing. None of us is the same man in old age that he was in youth, nor the same on the morrow as on the day preceding. Our bodies are hurried along like flowing waters. Every visible object accompanies time in its flight. Of the things which we see, nothing is fixed. Even I myself, as I comment on this change, am changed myself. So here he's talking about, the last two here, which essentially is the actual existing things, right? That would change over time, and then fictitious things that are really you can't describe, that are notions like void or time itself. Okay. In verse 23, he says, "This is what Heraclitus says. We go down twice into the same river and yet into a different river. For the stream still keeps the same name, but the water has already flowed past. Of course, this is much more evident in rivers than in human beings. Still, we mortals are also carried past in no less speedy a course, and this prompts me to marvel at our madness in cleaving with great affection to such a fleeting thing as the body, and in fearing lest someday we may die, when every instant means the death of our previous condition. Will you not stop fearing lest that may happen once, which really happens every day?" So this is where we're starting to get into some interesting points here. He's saying that, look, every day, essentially, your body is changing. So it's not the same as it was. Just like the river, when you put your hand into it one time, it changes. And so he's saying that, are you really fearing something which is already happening, or that's already going on in your body? Are you really going to fear death when each instant who we are, our previous condition, has changed? We've essentially died in a form, in a way. In verse 24, he says, "So much for man, a substance that flows away and falls, exposed to every influence, but the universe too, immoral and enduring as it is, changes and never remains the same. For though it has within all that it has had, it has it in a different way from that which it has had it. It keeps changing its arrangement." So the universe and everything changes. Even though it contains all the same things, the form of them has changed. Very well. You say, "What good shall I get from this fine reasoning?" None, if you wish me to answer your question. Nevertheless, just as an engraver rests his eyes when they have long been under a strain and are weary, and calls them from their work and feasts them, as the saying is, so we at times should slacken our minds and refresh them with some sort of entertainment. But let even your entertainment be work, and even from these various forms of entertainment you will select, if you have been watchful, something that may prove wholesome. So he's basically talking about, like, why even discuss this, and he's saying because it's kind of fun. Because it's like, if you're going to do something fun, hey, you might as well study philosophy and Plato and some kind of abstract ideas. That's basically what he's saying here. Okay. So in verse 26, he says, "That is my habit, Lucilius. I try to extract and render useful some element from every field of thought, no matter how far removed it may be from philosophy. Now, what could be less likely to reform character than the subjects which we have been discussing? And how can I be made a better man by the ideas of Plato? What can I draw from them that will put a check on my appetites? Perhaps the very thought that all these things which minister to our senses, which arouse and excite us, are, by Plato, denied a place among things that really exist." Okay, so he is asking the question. how does this even make sense, right? What can you learn from this? And he's saying, well, maybe the answer is that it's actually the things that he doesn't talk about that we know that are important. In verse 27, he says, such things are therefore imaginary, and though they are, for the moment, present as certain external appearance, yet they are in no case permanent or substantial. Nonetheless, we crave them as if they were always to exist, or as if we were always to possess them. We are weak, watery beings standing in the midst of unrealities. Therefore, let us turn our minds to things that are everlasting. Let us look up to the ideal outlines of all things that filt about on high, and to the God who moves among them and plans how he may defend from death that which he could not make imperishable because its substance forbade, and so by reason may overcome the defects of the body. Okay, so this starts to get a little bit complicated here. I mean, what he's saying here is he's saying, look, so we've got these imaginary things, all right, and they're not permanent or substantial, but we do want these things. We do believe that there is such things as these concepts we're talking about in philosophy, okay? And he's saying that, if we look at kind of the ideal outline of all things, then we can start to understand some of these specific things that came from the same place, right? So he's saying that, that, and to the God who moves among them and plans how he may defend from death that which he could not make imperishable because its substance forbade, and so by reason may overcome the defects of the body. So he's saying there's certain things that you don't have a tangible explanation for them, but they still exist, and there's still some reason to have these things. Okay, in verse 28, he says, for all things abide not because they are everlasting, but because they are protected by the care of him who governs all things. But that which was imperishable would need no guardian. The master builder keeps them safe, overcoming the weakness of their fabric by his own power. Let us despise everything that is so little an object of value that it makes us doubt whether it exists at all. Okay, so here he's kind of saying that, there are some things that that exist not because they're everlasting, but because they are actually protected by the care of what he calls the master builder, right? Which I would assume would be a reference to God, who keeps them safe, overcoming their weakness by the fabric of his own power, right? And so he's saying, let us despise everything that is so little of an object of value that it makes us doubt whether it exists at all. So, if something's so small of a value that we don't even recognize whether it exists at all, maybe it's not worth mincing the words about that thing. I think that's kind of what he's trying to say here. In verse 29, he says, let us at the same time reflect, seeing that providence rescues from its perils the world itself, which is no less mortal than we ourselves, to some extent, our petty bodies can be made to tarry longer upon earth by our own providence, if only we acquire the ability to control and check those pleasures whereby the greater portion of mankind perishes. So he's saying, look, here's the thing, all right? There are some things that you can learn in life that will help you to live longer, and it's worth learning some of those things, all right? And he says here, in verse 30, Plato himself, by taking pains, advanced to old age. To be sure, he was the fortunate possessor of a strong and sound body. His very name was given him because of his broad chest, but his strength was much impaired by sea voyages and desperate adventures. Nevertheless, by frugal living, by setting a limit upon all that rouses the appetites, and by painstaking attention to himself, he reached that advanced age in spite of many hindrances. So he's using Plato as an example. Plato took care of himself. He learned some things. He avoided some of the temptations in life that would have potentially ended his life earlier. And so he uses that as an example. All right. And he says here, I am sure that Plato had the good fortune, thanks to his careful living, to die on his birthday after exactly completing his 81st year. For this reason, wise men of the East, who happened to be in Athens at the time, sacrificed to him after his death, believing that the length of his days was too full for a mortal man, since he had rounded out the perfect number of 9 times 9. I do not doubt that he would have been quite willing to forego a few days from this total, as well as the sacrifice. So he's saying that, there's some people that really were quite what you call it, not superficial, but superstitious about that he exactly died 81 years after he was born, and that it was 9 times 9, and they made a big thing of that, but he's saying that I doubt Plato would have really cared about that. Frugal living can be one to old age, and to my mind, old age is not to be refused any more than it is to be craved. There is a pleasure in being in one's own company as long as possible when a man has made himself worth enjoying. The question, therefore, on which we have to record our judgment is whether one should shrink from extreme old age and should hasten the end artificially instead of waiting for it to come. A man who sluggishly awaits his fate is almost a coward, just as he is immoderately given to wine who drains the jar dry and sucks up even the dregs. So what he's saying here is he's saying, look, here's the real question, okay? Because it's fine, if you can live longer, why not? Not a big deal, okay? Maybe you shouldn't really seek that out, but if you can, sure, why not? Okay, especially if you've perfected yourself to the point that you actually enjoy your company. However, he's saying the big question is what about extreme old age? Should you end your life quickly or wait for it to come? Right. And he says there's, a man who's sluggishly awaits his fate is kind of almost a coward, but someone who's just, pushing it is also not exactly the best choice. Right. So he says here in verse 33, but we shall ask this question also. Is the extremity of life the dregs, or is it the clearest and purest part of all, provided only that the mind is unimpaired and the senses still sound, give their support to the spirit, and the body is not worn out and dead before its time? For it makes a great deal of difference whether man is lengthening his life or his death. So what he's saying here is he's saying, look, maybe the last part of your life is actually the best. If you're in sound mind and you still have a functioning body, then maybe that's actually the best, right? But what he's saying here also is that, look, here's the thing: the difference that it makes is whether a man is lengthening his life, so his livable life, or his death, if he's drawing out his death, and there is a big difference between the two, is what he's saying. Okay, so then he says here in verse 34, but if the body is useless for service, why should one not free the struggling soul? Perhaps one ought to do this a little before the debt is due, lest when it falls due, he may be unable to perform the act. And since the danger of living in wretchedness is greater than the danger of dying soon, he is a fool who refuses to stake a little time and win a hazard of great gain. So what he's putting forth here is he's saying, look, here's the deal, okay? So if your body becomes useless, kind of, it starts to become where it's not really useful for service, then why shouldn't you free the struggling soul? Why not? Okay, maybe what you should do is, before you're actually unable to take your life into your own hands, maybe you should take it into your hands then, because he's saying that the danger of living in wretchedness is greater than the danger of dying too soon. Right? It's not. It'd be better to live on your terms than to live in a state that you wouldn't want to live. That's his opinion on it. He says, few have lasted through extreme old age to death without impairment, and many have lain inert, making no use of themselves. How much more cruel, then, do you suppose it really is to have lost a portion of your life than to have lost your right to end that life? So he's saying that most people, by the time they get to old age, there's a lot wrong with them. Maybe they're just lying there. They've got no function. And he's saying, so, is it better? Which is more cruel, like to end your life early, or to have lost the right to be able to do it, right? To lose the control of it. That's his contention. In verse 35, he says, do not hear me with reluctance, as if my statement applied directly to you, but weigh what I have to say. It is this, that I shall not abandon old age if old age preserves me intact for myself and intact as regards to the better part of myself. But if old age begins to shatter my mind and to pull its various faculties to pieces, if it leaves me not life, but only the breath of life, I shall rush out of a house that is crumbling and tottering. So he's making his decision here. He's telling you that, look, if he gets into a state where, let's say he's a vegetable, where he's unable to function, he's going to take his life into his own hands. That's what he's saying. All right. In verse 36, he says, I shall not avoid illness by seeking death, as long as the illness is curable and does not impede my soul. I shall not lay violent hands upon myself just because I am in pain, for death under such circumstances is defeat. But if I find out that the pain must always be endured, I shall depart, not because of the pain, but because it will be a hindrance to me as regards to all my reasons for living. He who dies just because he is in pain is a weakling, a coward, but he who lives merely to brave out this pain is a fool. So he's saying that, look, if he gets into that state where, there's no, it's incurable, and he's in a great deal of pain, he's not going to just exit because of the pain, but he's going to exit because he's going to feel like there's no point. And so that he might as well take this into his own hands. In verse 37, he says, "But I am running on too long, and besides, there is a matter here to fill a day. How can a man end his life if he cannot end a letter? So farewell, the last word you will read with greater pleasure than all my deadly talk about death. Farewell." So that ends the letter, and it's an interesting letter. There's a lot here. The beginning part of it is a little bit difficult, and it doesn't apply as much to modern day times as he's, kind of discussing some trivia about words and in the language of the time. But then he does get into the important question of this letter, which is death, is whether or not it makes sense to prolong your life when you are incapacitated. At what point should you take your life into your own hands? And does it make sense to do that? And, and he has his opinion on this, and he provides some good evidence for it. I'm not entirely sure that I myself agree with all of that, but it is an interesting thing to think about and to have pre-thought about before the time comes. How will you handle it yourself, when that time comes for you, if it does? All right, that's it for this week. See you next time.